Hi everyone. So in this motion type video, we're going to specifically look at religion motions. Uh, Obviously, there are a lot of things we can talk about in religion motions. I'm not going to spend 2 hours trying to digest and create something that is equivalent to meaningful discourse on every religion on the planet. Instead, we're going to focus on some metrics that I think are common to all religion debates, some heuristics to help you try to generate cases in religion motions, and then try to implement those lessons into some motion examples. Okay, so let's start thinking about some metrics for the debate. Particularly, I think these are metrics that may be common to every type of religion debate, or at least debates that may also have religion subclashes. So let's think about metrics. So what do we mean by metric? A metric is just a something that changes in the debate that teams argue over only applies to their side. So in the case of this House would ban drugs, if one of the metrics was crime, if one of the arguments you want to reach was reducing or increasing crime, then the metric becomes level of criminal activity. And you can think of how that could be related to things like violent crime, how much crime doesn't gets reported, how much crime gets disclosed or attacked, etc. So let's look at some metrics that we could use commonly in a debate round. First is the idea of religious salvation. So naturally, the instrumental purpose of religion is usually to answer the metaphysical and more existential questions individuals have about themselves. But it's also the case that these individuals and humans in general don't get these existential and metaphysical questions from religion. You can argue, and I think it's quite persuasive and probably true, that the existential questions come from us. In this way, we can consider how motions involving religion, i.e., policies, prefers the world motions, or those that change the ways in which religions are constructed or integrate with the society, how that changes individuals' capacity to experience or believe they are en route to religious salvation. This can just be a type of metric that is far more instantiated on in individuals, a certain type of individuals' experiences in religion. Not just how much they buy in, which I think is a different metric, but just how people feel about the specific issue of their religious experience. I think the reason this is a metric of its own accord is the idea of salvation probably appeals and it is indeed foundational to the religious experience. I.e., if we commonly think about religions and buying and who religious people are, they're often individuals who are on that religion because of the unique path that that religion has or claims to have to their own salvation. Therefore, I think a lot of the ways people buy in or buy out of religions and how deep they enter into religions and how fervently believe and carry on their practices all comes from how narratives and how interactions create, sustain, formulate, maintain, or indeed undermine an individual's appreciation of their own salvation within that religious structure. So that is one metric that can exist in the debate. I think another metric that commonly exists in religion debates is institutional buy-in. By that, it's just commonly argued that motions can sometimes change a person's willingness to buy in, i.e., participate, support, both with their feet and their pockets, certain institutions. Here you can argue within a metric of the debate how it changes in people's buy-ins to certain institutions like the Catholic Church or certain parts of Islam or certain local community religions or centers of religion rather, and how this can have good or adverse effects. Good effects insofar as it may increase an individual's access to a certain type of community that can be very orientated to charity and emotional support, or harmful in the sense that if it causes institutions to people to buy out institutions, they lose those positive factors. Indeed, the inverse of those arguments are also true. Potentially, increased buy-in to religion could be argued to be a bad thing insofar as some communities can be religion itself can be coercive, but some communities lack accountability mechanisms and may have direct harms in forms of extraction of resources, or however Nietzschean you wish to be in your conceptualization of religion. So institutional buy-in is another metric we can afford in a religion debate. Another metric is institutional soft power. So rather than exploring the relationship a person has with the institution, we can explore the ways in which institutions have power to other institutions. In particular, this is a way churches, religious structures, and the ideas they forward can have influence in wider society. This could be political discourse. This could look like the ways education and healthcare policies are manufactured, particularly in countries that may be more or less religious. You can think about how much soft power the American church and Latin America, the Catholic Church has in Latin America, how much maybe has direct political support for supporting opposing political candidates, changing the landscape of what is acceptable in political discourse. You can imagine throughout history how much sway churches have had over female and general rights issues to do with sexuality and health, and to do what practice can be. Here you can think about other aspects of the world other places in the world that currently exist, where the power of institutions, particularly in theocracies that exist in Iran, and kind of theocracies, but not really, in places like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and other places in the Middle East, and indeed other places in Africa with the Christian religion, how much influence these institutions have, and indeed the south of America, like Georgia and places with the Presbyterian Church and places like that. So institutional soft power is another metric that can exist in the debate, similarly linking to the same impacts I talked about, i.e. if institutions are good, having greater soft power can be also therefore good, because it allows you to enact your positive materials. And inversely also true. You may wish to argue in a religion debate that religion and religious institutions are bad, and therefore reducing their soft power could be a morally good thing to support in the debate. And you can have some creativity with this. So institutional soft power can add to the minutiae different metrics we may wish to choose from in religion debates. A fourth could be just religious experience in and of themselves. So rather than the specific experience of salvation, you could argue that the way in which people feel comfortable, have trust, and interact with the community on a personal level, all is a metric in and of itself. As in, you can imagine how positive benefits of religion may not flow just specifically from salvation, but the community and support, etc., that develops around religion. And therefore, the experience of a person within that religious circle, both materially, i.e. whether or not they receive charity or whether or not they receive community, but also maybe metaphysically, how they feel quenched on their other types of metaphysical questions. I.e. a lot of religions don't just provide salvation in a metaphysical sense, but also provide metaphysical support, i.e. trying to quell the answers to the questions of why the world exists the way it is, especially when individuals are dealing with suffering in their own lives, that people they love die, or things don't work out in a relationship or whatever. Religions and the experience religions can provide can also be metrics within the debate. This is particularly useful in narrative debates involving different types of narratives that religions can promulgate, i.e. if we preferred a world that religions promulgated a conception of the material versus an immaterial afterlife, or the idea of an afterlife or no afterlife, or the idea of what is the route to salvation. Does salvation occur in the afterlife, or does it occur now in material satisfaction for faithful practices? How much emphasis do faithful practices indeed have in how much emancipation and positive godly support you get? All of these types of debates can really center down to the explaining and characterizing the influence of a religious person, the influence the religions and the ideas have on the experience of the person themselves. Another final common metric that is can be generally reached for in religion motions includes the idea of cohesion. This is where we start to consider how religion itself is a community, and how there are different religions, ergo different communities, and how there are communities that exist, there are collections of people who aren't religious as well. So therefore we have a basket or a bag of different types of communities, and motions about religion may affect the way in which these communities interact with each other, for positive or negative. So you can have there could be theoretical motions about narratives, structures of religion, presences of religion that have changed the cohesive or discohesive nature of communities over time or in different areas of the world, etc. The point of this slide is to express that here are examples of 5 metrics that you can use to prompt for case generation, but also ones that you can keep in the back of your mind, especially for extensions when it comes to religion motions, particularly if you're trying to diversify the types of cases you think are running, and particularly if you don't have intuitive ideas about different ways to structure ideas within prep, and indeed in case generation. So those are the 5 different metrics that I think you could use within religion motions for those things I just said. Cool. So now that we've instantiated those metrics, let's have a look at how to formally develop these into analysis, as in how to not just make the claim of a change of religious experience of salvation, but try to prove that a claim of religious salvation experience is a change in the debate. What I think is important to flag from the offset is saying the power of this metric, and the reason why it may be strategically useful to choose this within what kind of arguments you push in the religion motions, is that it's very easy to weigh, right? By weighing here, I just mean explaining and convincing the judges that this metric, this thing's impact, this change in the world, is something that is an important thing, and thus something that is not just important, actually, but the most important thing relative to other things that could be addressed in the motion. This is because it's probably foundational, right? So the way in which individuals internalize their conception of a narrative of religion, i.e., how they feel about their own salvation, but more broadly how their experience in the religious institution is quite intuitively foundational to all of the other metrics we talked about, right? If you have a bad religious experience, you're likely to disengage from that religion, i.e., you have institutional buyout. Insofar as this probably means people participate less, give less money, talk less respectably about the institution, and foster it less support in society, the institution's soft power decreases, and especially insofar as people can have different experiences and different reactions to changes in the motion. As in, if the motion is foundationally or even on the surface level changing a capacity or a narrative or a belief or a structure or an implementation of a religion, it will not cause the same effects to everybody. Different people will have different commitment levels, different lived experiences, and indeed therefore different reactions to the way in which religious motions change their conceptualization of their place within religion and what religion can offer them. Thus, argumentation about experience and salvation probably is the analysis that underpins ideas of discohesion, right? If there is discohesion within movements, i.e. changes in intracohesion, this is probably because different people have different lived experience, different reactions to the change in the motion about experience, and therefore maybe have apathy to each other or maybe hostility to each other. Similarly, the ways in which narratives can shape people's conception of other religions, and therefore foundationally changing their conception of what salvation looks like to them, obviously is a mechanism that underpins why discohesion, or indeed in the inverse, cohesion might exist between inter-religious communities, i.e. Christians versus Muslims, or Jewish people versus Hindu people, or Sikhs versus insert other religion, Buddhists rather, incorrect conjugation. So you can see how that type of analysis within that metric can be foundational to most religion debates. It's also the case that within itself, it constitutes a lot of material in a debate. So just because one team in your opening has touched upon the idea of religious salvation and experience, I think it is a misstep to think that you cannot expand upon that material. Because I think the idea of religious experience and the reality of salvation and experience in and of itself provides exceptionally dense and diverse, ample opportunities for characterization. As in, I think experience is not just unitary, is not just singular, and is not just restricted to the time. What I mean by that is naturally different people feel differently about religion and what emotion may be changing about a religious experience. But people themselves, in reaction to emotion, can have a journey through a different religious experience. So just because opening government or an opening team could have proven in one instance to one type of person at one type of time why it is a good or bad thing, depending on what their burden is, and how the motion about religion has changed individuals' experiences, there's ample characterization about the way in which that person might have a shaped belief into the long run. Also a case in which how individuals use their experience to interact with different facets of society. So there are different ways in which, so religious experience could mean the way in which people internalize it and feel about themselves, could be the way in which they feel about their proximate community, could be the way in which you feel about their future community, it could be the way in which you feel about their future self, it could be an inherent drive to ways in which they satisfy other aspects of their life, could be about how deep they enter into metaphysical beliefs in themselves, could be even, quite simply, the way in which they interact with things like charity and other organizations and teachings in the first place. I think the variety of religious experience, as one psychologist once said, is quite diverse and broad. And there is a lot of interesting material, both just in a conversational sense, but also therefore passing into a debating sense that you can use on this metric within a debate. I think I don't want to necessarily give you, 22 different ways in which you could mechanize this claim. All I'm trying to point out here is this is something that is very much worthy to consider in a religion debate. And I think something that actually, the power of this comes from the reflection of the personal, which I think is the unique joy and the things I enjoy most about religion motions is oftentimes the analysis teams run and the analysis that teams generate is usually very strong, and that's because it's often based upon their actual own interpretation of religion. What I think this means is the analysis becomes intuitive because it just becomes a description about your experience with religion or the ways in which you understand people to interpret religion. Remember that this is a core basis, I think, of the analysis of religion motions and can be very useful, but always remember to try to step outside of your own conception and appreciate how different people will conceive this differently. Thus, I don't think these are the debates where you want to sit back as a debater and hypothetically interpret the world, and like we would in a finance motion or econ motion or IR motion. I think in these motions, the power of it comes from the internal reflection you have within yourself as you're debating, as you're trying to generate a case. If you're trying to run a case about religious experience that to you does not sound intuitive, to you sounds like bullshit, it probably is, and therefore probably isn't that persuasive. If you can explain why someone would have a different foundational experience as a result of emotion about religion, and you could explain why they are likely to feel it, similarly because of the ways you would feel about this, I think that means that analysis doesn't become too tricky in this motion, these types of motions. I think that's where the main source of inspiration probably should come, particularly if you're going to argue this type of metric on religious experience and salvation. Okay, so that's religious experience and salvation. So let's look at how we could approach analyzing the other arguments. So those that are not on necessarily the individual level, but those that are maybe on the institutional level. So the actual ways in which those emergent properties of individuals, communities, etc. interact. I think the point I want to get through across in this slide is whilst I think religious experience and the ways people appreciate their salvation can be made prior to everything about institutional power, it's also the case I think a lot of aspects of institutional power can also be made prior to religious experience in some ways. So what I mean by that, like the capacity for a religion to not just trivially expand and export its ideology and its belief systems, but also the ways in which that institution can reflect people's actual experiences in the ways that they'll find palatable, i.e. they can get, preference optimization in terms of the ways in which they're going to develop their ideology. Once again, if you want to take a Nietzschean view of the way in which religions develop their ideology, all of that capacity is always probably dependent upon the institution's power, right? Because if the institutions aren't powerful or don't have a degree of influence, it's unclear why they could inspire religious experience and salvation to uniquely empower them, i.e. the roots of analysis that a team may argue is prior to X. In actual fact, X can sometimes be prior to that impact, like a Spider-Man meme, almost. So independent of that, I think the additional utility of having the metric being institutional power is I think it acts as a larger scale of impact, right? Because individual experiences can be made to be perceived as quite innocuous and complex in a way that is strategically useful in the debate. So whilst there is nuance, what nuance often does is it makes it unclear if there is actually a delta. So if different people have access to if different people will feel differently, it suggests that the net contribution of that is zero. So maybe half of people feel better, half of people feel worse. Naturally, a part of the debate would be arguing why there is a net number of individuals positive or net number of negative. But let's look at the ways we can use institutional power as either to explain why that clash could not be useful, but just within in itself, what kind of arguments, what kind of analysis rather can we use to generate their arguments. So I think things like buy-in are probably useful because of their priority, but things like soft power can also just be useful for the how much influence that community, the religious community and religious structures can have on the world in general, right? Because the greater the soft power of the religious institution, it's likely the greater its capacity to do good stuff. You have more donations, which means it maybe can end up donating more. In some ways, you can think of large institutions like you can think of large companies, i.e. they access some argument of economies of scale. They have established distribution routes for charity that is maybe more effective than an individual private actor, or even just an individual institution of charity themselves, insofar as if a church or a religious institution is powerful, they often are aligned to the powers of state actors that may be more reticent about having, Western charitable institutions in their region. So you can think of the instrumentally positive utile nature of religions beyond experience, but just as bases of good economic and social support, i.e. the schools in Latin America that are built and funded and supported by the Catholic Church, for instance. So therefore, what I'm fundamentally trying to get across here is that institutional power can be an explanation basis of which you get to good religious experiences, i.e. a religion's capacity to do good is obviously dependent on the people's buying into the institution, but the buy-in of the institution might be based on the power of that institution a priori, rather than just religious experience. Naturally, we have to think about some of the preconditions to get to that analysis, right? So where does institutional power come from? It probably comes from a multifaceted different ways, but I think the three broad things you could use as mechanisms are firstly just trivially resources. If an institution has more money, if it has more land, if it has more rights to build, has more access to distribution, then it probably is by definition more powerful, but in actuality more powerful, because obviously it can give more charity, etc. Secondarily is confidence. I think this is a piece of analysis I haven't seen used that often, but one that at least I find intuitively quite persuasive, which is the power of an institution comes not just through the dollar in their hands, but how much people have confidence that they are good actors in themselves. Either because this is the reason people give loads of money, i.e. you're not going to give money to a religion that you don't think is good for you or good for anybody else. But it's also the case that a lot of the power that the institutions have to shape narratives and also to shape community decisions comes from the confidence that you place in their word, right? A lot of the metaphysical aspects of nature are sometimes locked in by religions, but are oftentimes accessible by other means, right? It is untrue that individuals cannot access a metaphysical truth without a religion, i.e. there are minutiae of different people who aren't religious but nevertheless have their own answers to metaphysical quandaries, i.e. they buy into general narratives that exist in society anyway, i.e. spiritualistic-esque narratives. So the confidence a religion can bestow is maybe what allows it to have a unique grasp of an individual's perceptions of what the answers to metaphysical problems are. I.e., if you have a confidence in an institution, you're more likely to buy into the ideology of that institution as opposed to the general ideologies you already have access to. Here you can think of confidence, as sometimes I do, in analogies to the marketplace of ideas, but just general markets as well. It is not the case that there is just one idea that's sold out to you like a monopoly. Different narrative generators, religions, non-religions, etc., are competing for the attention source of people. So therefore, the more confidence a religion can instill in itself, and therefore it's from that its validity and trust you have that it has the correct answer, that's where power can come from. So this can be a way in which you can mechanize why there is a delta, both on institutional power and from that everything that flows from it. Last, just things like political soft power. So you can imagine if an institution is quite powerful and can shape politicians to agree with its ideology and to promote things like policy, but also social norms around that religious belief, it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, as in people are born into a society that is broadly pro a certain religion, either softly, in the case of England with Christianity, whereby in lots of schools in England, Christian-esque messages are still educated because the narratives that particularly conservative governments formulate about what makes a good person, i.e. a charity individual, more monotheistic. Like you don't. Anyway, you know what I. Hopefully, you know what I mean. This becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, such that political soft power is the instantiation of the power of that institution. Thus, once that institution's power is more instantiated, you get other aspects to impacting, i.e. why people actually access the religious experience. So those are three ways in which you can explain where institutional power comes from, and indeed why institutional power may fall prey to the other metrics about individuals' experiences. Okay, so let's try to instantiate those ideas, i.e. the five metrics we thought about, both on the individual level, i.e. religious salvation and experience, but also on the institutional level, i.e. religious institutional buy-in, institutional soft power, and some aspects of cohesion, which is kind of a bridge between the two scales. So let's say for the emotion, quite classic, this house prefers a world without religion. So what are the possible metrics of this debate? So maybe you want to pause and just think about how you would argue different metrics and what indeed they are. So here we could talk about the religious experience, i.e. maybe uniquely in this motion, a unique type of religion. Sorry, religions as an institution are uniquely capable of instantiating a version X of a religious idea. Maybe the notion of metaphysical truth is not something that is dependent upon religious institutions, but a certain type of metaphysical narrative demands institutions. Here you can think about the ways institutions are centralizing and normalizing figures, i.e. they consolidate around one narrative, they're able to perpetuate it, they're able to instantiate it consistently over time, and therefore things like consistency, things like permanency, things like mass appeal, and therefore mass buy-in, and therefore mass reinforcement of one particular idea, is probably something that is unique to having a religious institution. Whereas if you didn't have a world without religion, i.e. whether this means institutions in the debate or whether this is framed definitionally by OG's fiat to be the notion of a god, which could be an even more interesting debate, there's nonetheless metaphysical questions are always answered by people who can think, and answers will always be found to a varying degree of appeal. So we can think about why, if religion indeed is about an anthropomorphic version of that metaphysical answer, i.e. there is a god that does things in the world that exists beyond the immaterial realm, why that might be a better or worse effect of interreligious experience, whether that means people feel better about themselves, more accountable to morality, whether or not they can actually have greater faith as a result because of its understandability or its comprehension more broadly, etc. That's delving into some of the ideas and some of the things we could think about by using the metric of religious experience in this motion. We could also just look at the other metrics, things like institutions. Is institutional soft power, is existence or non-existence a good thing? So here is a debate in and of itself, i.e. a clash of the debate would be, is having institutions a good or bad thing in the first place? So their influence in politicians throughout history being good or bad on net, etc. Quite a deep emotion if you consider the ways you can see even if you're aware that this motion was deep, I think considering the 5 metrics that I mentioned demonstrates just how deep that motion is. You could also just talk about other things like cohesion, how the ways in which different communities would or wouldn't have interacted with each other positive or negatively as a result of religious institutions or whatever would have ended up replacing religious institutions. Whether there would have been some degree of grand narratives that would have kept people apart or kept people more together, etc., etc. You can consider how cohesion could be a metric you could frame a delta in the debate. Granted, the analysis of cohesion seems the least intuitive, as it's probably true that the reasons people remain reasons that lead to religions to being bad, i.e. consolidation of resources, us versus them narratives to instantiate and retain your followers for all economic and pernicious self-power incentives, are all reasons that any social institution would do that. So it's unclear if that it has too much of a delta, but maybe you can think of creative ways in which that could be true. Debating is not least fun because you shouldn't just do what you know will be successful in debate, but not that which probably genuinely interests you. If you didn't do that, then you get bored of this activity probably very, very quickly. So those are some of the metrics in the debate, just trying to instantiate and exemplify how they can be used. So what I want to do now is explain maybe a different way you could approach case generation. So let's say those ideas of metric setting, which appeal to me in intuitions of how to generate cases, don't appeal to you. Here is another system to think about generation of cases. It's not necessarily about just metrics, i.e. what could be agreed about teams to be important, and then whether or not they have a change. Maybe you want to just start at first basis about things that just may uniquely only change to your side, and then build comparatives after that. So here's another sort of way in which you consider the central elements of religion debates. So first could be the idea about conflict. It seems I see this quite frequently when I'm judging, that in religion debates, the first thing people usually go to is the idea of conflict. So sometimes there are motions about changing attitudes of religion or external actor changing religion in some way, i.e. a state creating or funding institutions to allow people to leave religion, for instance. Here you can just think about the idea of conflict, right? Religion motions are often those that are centered around the interaction with society and religions, but also the interaction between different actors in a religion against each other. So here, this naturally calls to the idea of conflict. So your first question when you see a motion might be, how does this change conflict? Who is going to conflict more with each other? Is this a good or bad thing? So you can think both in two levels here. One could be inter-conflict, as in conflict towards one type of religion from other actors, whether it be those that aren't religious, or whether it be those that are communities of different faiths. Or we can consider intra-conflict, as in how are actors within a religion going to see each other as a result of this motion? Are they going to be friendlier, more negative to each other? And what kind of effect is this going to have? Is this going to mean that people's lives become worse? Is this going to lead to scattering or splintering of ideals? Is this going to break up communities? Is this going to result in backlash that is harmful? So conflict can be a way in which you, at least in your own mind, frame what you want to get out of your prep and frame what kind of argument you want to talk about. It's quite intuitive to why conflict might matter the most, in the sense that it probably is foundational to how people approach religion, in the sense that nobody has a good experience if everyone around them hates them. That may be a hyperbole, but you get what I mean. Along the same lines, you could think about the ideas of schisms. So by schisms, we just mean conflict and discohesion to the sense of breaking. So rather than just considering conflict on a micro level, oftentimes there are emotions about religions that are very broad scale and very retrospective. So for the example of This House Prefers a World Without Religion, it has a massive delta baked into the debate. The world, in some ways, probably is going to look massively different. But you can also have other motions like This House Prefers a World where Islam had a central authority as opposed to having a more decentralized authority, or literally no authority system in certain respects. That, you can imagine, has a lot of conflict, but specifically has a lot of schism dynamics that could exist in the debate. So the question you could ask yourself, other than conflict, is this going to foundationally change the way in which this religion functions? Is it going to foundationally change the way people interact with that religion and the way in which different religions interact with each other? So schisms are like conflict, but on a far larger scale. Taking it down from the idea of conflict, you might want to try to think about individuals. So how is this motion about religion going to affect people's relationship to themselves, relationship to their religion, relationship with the metaphysical questions, and relationship to each other? All of this can codify to the ideas of trust, things like crises, things like just general backlash on an individual level. This could be a way in which you could prompt to come up with other ideas in a religion round. From an individual, you might want to think, okay, how does this motion instead affect communities and families, particularly families where throughout generations there is changes in religiosity within that family? I.e., you consider different frames of families, i.e. families who have lived in the same country, as opposed to families that have emigrated from one religious denomination center to another, i.e. those that emigrate from the Middle East, or those that are migrants that, because of various extraneous factors of their circumstances, have to emigrate and flee and be refugees. How does the motion affect how they interact with society? In a sense, how do they transition and live in circumstances that are different from the foundation of their religion and their other communities? Here you can use the characterization about how, whilst it might not appear to us in the West to be true, it is true both in the West and the rest of the world that religions for a lot of people shape the very way in which they view their place in the world and set standards, norms, and expectations for how people in the community can interact. Like, you can think about the way a secular person perceives what society and people around them should treat them like, as opposed to those that grew up in a Presbyterian family and community in Georgia, or those that grew up in a Sunni area in Saudi Arabia or Iraq, for instance. All of these things can, the aspect of that religious experience can foundationally change, and an emotion themselves can foundationally change that degree of small-scale cohesion within a community. Here it's quite easy to weigh why the communities matter most to people, insofar as they provide the first bedrock of self-defense against any degree of harm, as in poverty can be best alleviated by having a community and a family. Emotional distress is predicated on having a trusting family dynamic that you can rely upon, etc., etc. So that might be another way in which you can prompt yourself a case generation. Lastly, similar to the metric I've already mentioned, pathway to God. Do not underestimate in religion motions just how persuasive explaining how the motion changes a person's appreciation of their own religion and the way in which they feel religion. Try to refrain as much as possible from just being a basic bitch and using basic generalization like religions are tyrannical, coercive actors that are just extracting people. They are inherently coercive and ergo bad. There are a lot of interesting aspects of religion that are good for so many individual people. Yes, obviously there are harms religious institutions do. Obviously there are child abuse scandals in this Catholic Church. Obviously certain churches are certain institutions are incredibly coercive in the way they will only allow you access to monetary resources if you sign up to their religion. Obviously, you can analyze the incentive structures of religions to make them as pernicious as possible. But remember, there are other good aspects about religion that I think, at least as much as I've seen in religion motions, are very underutilized. And it might just be mentally strategic to exploit this angle that I think is very persuasive, especially if teams are not going to engage in that level of complexity and nuance. If you are the one that does, judges can see that, recognize that, find it interesting, give you high speaks if that's what you care about. So these are the different ways in which a second set of ways you can think about generating cases. So in the rest of this presentation, we're just going to look at trying to instantiate the metrics themselves into different motion types. So let's look at this motion then. So this house believes religions should promise reward in the afterlife, as opposed to promising material reward in this life, with both outcomes contingent on faithful practices. So, what kind of metrics do you think exist in the debate? What kind of arguments could you run on Gov and Op? So, let's use this motion to go through the first exemplar list of metrics. So first is religious salvation. So naturally this motion probably may change the way people perceive their route to salvation, obviously per the motion. But I think the thing that should jump out to you is the way in which people self-validate whether the message is true, right? So on government side, it's trivially true that if you promise something in the afterlife, you're promising something that has no verification in the material. So you can never truly know on government side if your faithful practices are actually going to lead to good outcomes. Or in opposition side, there is that feedback mechanism, right? If you're doing faithful practices and you're achieving material awards, that means you must be achieving salvation, because likely the religions would codify this in the idea of metaphysical truth and metaphysical salvation. Similarly, if you weren't achieving material awards in spite of what you perceive to be faithful practices, this may cause a degree of crises within yourself. So within the idea of religious salvation experience, you can see many burdens flowing out from that, i.e., do people need self-verification to believe more fervently or believe in a different way that it's important, or can they or do they not need this in order to access that degree of a type of salvation, a type of perception of salvation and experience? Similarly, how do people internalize whether or not they are actually receiving material rewards? Like, is it the case that it actually becomes a self-reinforcing cycle in a different way? As in, people may reflect that they are being faithful, thus, whilst they may not objectively be achieving greater material rewards, they perceive as if they are because they expect to see that they are. Or I imagine there are different types of people that would in reality show these different types of features. There'd be some people who maybe are not materially very bad off, that would, per this narrative, maybe be more positively reflective of the things they do have in their life because they're searching for it. Someone who is not in desperate poverty, that has a life and education, a house, a family, a dog, etc., may just appreciate, if they are buying into religion in the first place, appreciate their material results more because they're expecting to look at that material reward for instantiation of their faithful practice. Likewise, there might be individuals who just are in physical destitution, physical, economic, and social destitution, that as much as positive reinforcement, positive outlook might be good, just don't feel it, and this may cause crises of faith. You can think about how that impacts institutional power within those regions, institutional buy-in within those regions. I think maybe there's a broader argumentation to also be had on the ways in which how this roots the notion of salvation itself, right? So on government side, the root of salvation remains the metaphysical, as in your rewards are beyond the material, which may be ways in which it frames ideas of pain and suffering, right? Because I think the ways in which the religions will try to explain and persuade individuals of either version of the narrative would end up solidifying but also bringing in other aspects of what it means to have rewards from a religion. In government side, it may remain the same ideas in the metaphysical that we see now, as in the access to heaven and the afterlife of the judgment, etc. And the ultimate fear that in some people's minds that they need to keep being good, and there's a race to the top and being good because you never truly know if you're going to get into heaven, etc. Versus an opposition side where maybe the narrative becomes much more materialistic, right? Maybe it moves away from the idea of metaphysics in itself, because the ways in which they'll educate individuals is that presumably a God who is all powerful and all loving, if they are making faithful practices material contingent upon faithful practices, must value the material more than the immaterial, because why else would God in their infinite wisdom educate on that way? And in a more maybe cynical sense, why would religions try to educate the masses that actually metaphysical does matter, but material also matters as well? Try not to think about that too complexly. They might therefore, because of limited time, resources, or just the pure mechanisms of logic, and throughout evolutions of theologians, prize the material more than the supernatural as a result. You can think about the ways in which that has spillover effects to broader values of materialism, i.e. materialism is often something that is, at least in the West, conceptually seemed to be linked to the idea of nihilism, right? If you're focused on the material ultimately doesn't bring you value. It's not a means in and of itself, it's a means to an end. It isn't an end in and of itself. You can consider and try to maybe in this motion interact with the idea, i.e. using your intuitions and your own psychological reasoning to persuade the judges that that is a true statement, and therefore this narrative would not be fundamentally appealing to anybody. Ergo, it impact all of the other metrics, i.e. people would buy out more, the power would be less. Granted, there's a degree of nuance here, right? I imagine religions would try to educate this in a way that has maximal collective appeal. So don't try to, just be too single-minded and focused about what that interpretation would be. But I appreciate a layer of nuance. So that's some exemplification, at the very least. Obviously, there's a lot more you could say about the motion, but hopefully that has been somewhat useful. The last example I want to say is an example of a motion that is not in its face about religion, but that has a sub-religion clash, or sub-clash about religion. So the motion this house regrets the decline of humanities in higher education. The reason, I'm not going to explain this too much, but I think I just want to highlight that this motion can also have a religion clash, right? So you can think about the way in which what humanities means in higher education can have an aspect of theology taught within it. As in, a part of humanities, i.e. the study of humanity, and the impressions and interpretations people will have in humanities can have a theological basis, at least in the ways in which higher education will try to teach it, and awareness therefore people have of the history of religion. Here you can have a very inventive extension if you could find nothing else, or nothing else that you thought was interesting and worthy to talk about, on religion. Here I just want to exemplify that religion, the ideas we talked about the metrics of religion debates, need not only be applied to debates that have the word religion or specific religious connotations in them. The ideas of religion, the way in which people interpret religion, internalize ideas, messages, narratives about the metaphysical, are things that can apply to motions that you may not initially expect them to. Debating should be a bit more about creativity. I think we don't see as much creativity nowadays, and debating was such a shame. I say that as if I'm an oldie. I mean, I have been doing this for too long. So I remember previously people being far more inventive with motion, with the arguments and extensions they generate. You're not just always running a boring analytical extension, but being a bit more inventive. And I think this is an example of a type of motion where maybe you could introduce a religion clash in CG, where OCO rather, where we don't regret. CG, I was correct. We regrets always fucking confuse me. The regret that we do regret the decline in humanities and higher education because it reduced the number of individuals that have maybe access to the knowledge of religions, were therefore increased in the diversity of different religions that could exist, were instrumentally beneficial because of the way in which religions were vehicles to understand cross cultures, and the ways that they could be used to help, in other social dynamics. Like if humanities are declining in education, you're declining the number of thought leaders of humanity that exist in higher education institutions, and thus, considering that most academics end up entering into administrative areas to begin with, considering that a lot of universities are homogenized in the ways in which they don't have the most diverse academics, if you do have academics that are focused on issues that are diverse, particularly religions that often are really good vehicles to cross into different cultures, how that could have been good for EDI reasons, in diversity and inclusion stuff within higher institutions, which you could link to other impacts that may exist in the debate, i.e. Minority buy-in, minority access, student access, etc. So those are some examples of the ways in which I think you can approach religion debates and some exemplifications. Hope this has been useful. Any comments, queries, clarifications, critiques, feel free to put them in the comments. Yeah, see you around.